And as we continue the show, we are very honored to be joined by Cliff Albright, who is a co-founder of Black Voters Matter, coming to us live from the bus, traveling around the country, working on voting rights issues. Mr. Albright, thank you so much for joining us here on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Well, there's so much to really talk about, especially in the context of voter suppression and voter protection. And one thing I just wanted to start with is, a number of people have seen over the past couple weeks very long lines in some places like Atlanta and other places like that. I feel like every election, primary, whatever it may be, we have similar stories of these very long lines, primarily in Black communities, oftentimes. And you just start to wonder when you see this happen many times, is this incidental, or should this be considered a part of or within the broader conversation about voter suppression?
Yeah, unfortunately, we have to consider it as part of the broader conversation because of the very reason that you mentioned. One, there's no randomness to where this is taking place, right? It disproportionately happens in Black communities and precincts that are in Black communities and affecting Black and brown voters. And so we know that that's the case. We know that the reasons why it happens are often very predictable reasons. It's reasons of not having enough polling machines. We've seen situations in Georgia where there were machines that didn't even have power cords so that the machines could be on. It's because of a lack of poll workers in some precincts. And oftentimes it's because polls have been closed. Like we've seen a drastic reduction in just in the number of polling places in communities, again, disproportionately impacting Black communities. We've seen a reduction in the number of days that are available for early voting, which again means that you're going to have more people each day. And so all of these things are very predictable. And you could even say, as one court said at one point regarding gerrymandering, that they take place with surgical precision, impacting Black voters. And of course, that's to be combined, the long lines are to be combined with all the other issues of voter suppression, voter purges from voter rolls, which also adds to the long lines, because sometimes the lines are long because there are so many people that are dealing with issues of they're not showing up on a voter list. They thought that they were registered. They may have voted even as recently as the last primary election, but now all of a sudden they're no longer on the voter list. And so all of those issues then compile and add up. So not only is it impacting the individual voter whose name is no longer on the list or who's having some other type of problem, but now it's affecting everybody else because it's making the lines be longer and take longer to go down.
I think that's such an important issue of the voter purges. And I was hoping you could explain for people how some of this happens, because I think a lot of people, they might see the stories, and many of these Secretary of States will say, well, we sent a letter to someone and they just never returned it, and try to make it seem as if it's almost voter error for these hundreds of thousands of people to be purged cycle after cycle.
Yeah, so what we've seen is, like, in Georgia is a perfect example, right? In the state of Georgia, they purged some 300,000 voters. We found out that, and through the work of investigative journalist Greg Palast, they found out that 200,000 of those that were purged because they, like you said, did not return some mail, did not even receive the mail. They were purged because it was assumed that they had moved. But what we found out is that 200,000 of those voters had not moved. In fact, what had happened is that the Secretary of State used a vendor, an address verification vendor, to send those notices, and they didn't use the approved vendor that the Postal Service uses, right? And so, in other words, they just went out to somebody's cousin and said, hey, give me a list of addresses, sent out this very critical message using, Joe Schmo's list of addresses, and then surprised when 200,000 people didn't return it, but you didn't use the exact address that the Postal Service says that you should be using. So those folks had never moved. They were still living in the places where they said that they had been living. Wow. They just never got the mail and it was never returned, but they got purged, illegally purged. And so these are the types of things that we're up against, where not only are they trying to purge us, but they're using illegal sources, unverified sources, to even get the addresses on which they're doing the purges.
One of the things that I think a lot of people are concerned about is this issue of intimidation at the polling places, both the voters themselves or, public interest organizations that are trying to help people vote or whatever they're there to do in assisting people's process of voting. How concerned are you about that in this fall election?
We're very concerned. When the orange man who was in the White House got on the stage and put out a call to white nationalists and told them to stand by and to go to the polling places and watch. We're seeing the real life, real time implications of that. We've had workers who were doing exactly what you were just describing in Albany, Georgia. That's in Southwest Georgia, Dougherty County, Georgia. We have workers and partners that are out at the polling places, again, where there are long lines, like we just discussed. And what are they doing? They're giving snacks. They're providing water. They're providing masks for anybody who's online who doesn't have masks. Our workers were threatened first by an individual white voter who said that they were intimidating her, that they were playing music that was too loud, that they were buying votes. She even took pictures, not just of our staff and our partners, but of random black voters, posted those messages on Facebook, inciting people in some of these hate groups that they need to go out, telling people that she was surrounded, that she was being intimidated, right? Trying to then complain to the poll officials who at first were pretty much thankful that folks were out there giving this type of voter support. And so we're seeing the real life implications of this. And eventually what happened with this woman is that, one, they had the poll workers, the poll clerks had to move her off the line and let her vote early, let her skip the line so that she could vote, just so that they could eliminate her as a source of drama and conflict. But two, after she voted, before leaving, she pulls out a gun on our workers and on our partners. This is the type of violence and hate and action that's being incited when somebody says to stand by, right? We're seeing the real life implications of that on the ground, both in terms of individual voters like this, but also in terms of election officials taking their cue and then saying to our workers, you can't be here, or you can't be with the 150 feet because you're campaigning, because they've got on a Black Voters Matter shirt. Having on a Black Voters Matter shirt or a Black Lives Matter shirt or I love Black people shirt or whatever the shirt is, just being Black is not campaigning, right? That's not a violation of the law. But again, when you've got election officials in these counties and states that view Blackness itself as being problematic, that's the kind of treatment. And so we have people that are threatened with being arrested if they come in within 150 feet marker, even though they're not campaigning. All they're doing is giving out food. And even though they don't have on candidate paraphernalia, all they have on is something that declares Black Voters Matter, which I would think is not a controversial statement.
You would think so, and I mean, I think it's probably not lost on many people when you mention Albany, Georgia, among other places. I mean, it seems like some of the most harrowing stories coming from these heartlands of the civil rights movement of the 1960s. I mean, I think a lot of times we talk about the civil rights movement, we talk about the Voting Rights Act as sort of the past, as if this is a previous, some previous issue. But how much is this issue of voter suppression and the fight against it connected to that same history that obviously goes back even prior to the civil rights movement around voting rights issues for Black people?
Yeah, I mean, it obviously has got a long history, and it's got a history, to be honest, that's not just rooted in the South, right? Even though much of that history, much of those battles took place in the South, the fact is, I always remind people of what Brother Malcolm said: if you south of the Canadian border, you're in the South.
Right.
And so we've seen, similar situations of voter suppression, even in places like Pennsylvania and Michigan. Even on this tour that we're on, we've been on the road now for about 25 days, and one of the most challenging situations and threatening situations we faced was in Ohio, not even in the South. But with that said, there is obviously a unique connection to the movements of the civil rights movement, to what used to take place largely in the South, because what happens is, unlike some of the northern situations of voter suppression, right, where you're at least likely to get some kind of media attention, right? Usually you're in some kind of media market. A lot of it takes place in these rural communities, communities that don't get a lot of media attention, communities where you've got small organizations that don't get a lot of national support. These are the types of places where we think it's particularly important for us to do our work and for us to do a bus tour saying that we got power and driving around in what we call the Blackest Bus in America, because in those communities, when this suppression takes place, a lot of times it's unfettered. It's taking place. It's almost like it's a petri dish. It's a laboratory where those who mean to do wrong are doing so in darkness, and they're able to just kind of experiment and come up with all kinds of concoctions for new and creative ways to suppress the vote. And then what happens is, like any experiment, once it gets perfected in those environments, it then gets exported to the rest of the state or to the rest of the country. And so it's very important that we pay attention to those communities that we often don't think about. Again, those smaller communities, those rural communities. It's why one of our 5 pillars, one of our 5 core beliefs is that Black voters matter everywhere.
I think that's such an important issue. And just sort of a final question here that I'll ask you is, I mean, obviously, despite all of this and hearing all of this, many more people know that their right to vote is imperiled, or at least that someone's trying to take it away. On the bus tour, what sort of resonance have you been hearing and receiving from communities of people who are determined, to vote, maybe not just for the sake of voting, but really to make sure that their rights are safeguarded?
The thing that we found, especially for disengaged voters, is that the best issues to serve as an on-ramp for them to get reconnected to civic engagement and voting has got to be something very local, very specific, something that they know and can relate to. Sometimes it's that local issue of police violence. Sometimes it's that local issue of a local ballot initiative. Sometimes it's a local issue around housing and gentrification. The more disengaged a voter is, the more important it is that what's going to bring them back is going to be something that they can easily relate to, that impacts their daily lives. The top of the ticket is important. Don't get me wrong. Most important election ever, at least in our lifetimes, right? In terms of the top of the ticket. But for some people, that's just not enough, because what they're most concerned about is like, what's the school policies affecting their kids, and what's going on with coronavirus, and whether or not the kid's going to be in school, or what's going on with their job, or what's going on in the local community, what's going on with housing policy, what's the local policies regarding utility moratoriums and rent moratoriums. So for a lot of people, those are the issues that are even more important than the top of the ticket. When we have those kinds of conversations with people, when we center not just the voting process, but when we center the issues, what their hopes and their dreams and their objectives are, their concerns for themselves and their families, when that's the centering of the discussion, not just voting as ritual, then we see that we get a different reaction. But we're seeing a lot of excitement everywhere we go, and from from urban parts of the states we're in to the rural parts of the states we're in. Everywhere we go, we're seeing a lot of excitement and energy. People want change.